Hello and welcome to another episode of Transport in Africa, a weekly podcast dedicated to spotlight cutting-edge research, innovations, and ideas shared in transport systems across Africa. I am your host, Polycarp Chebe. In each episode, we sit down with a researcher, practitioner, or change maker who is redefining how mobility works in Africa. In today's episode, we are turning our focus to Namibia to talk about road transport emissions. Road transport plays a vital role in connecting goods and people within and across cities, but it is also a growing source of emissions with significant implications for public health, climate change, and urban sustainability. Namibia is a country where mobility needs are evolving alongside environmental concerns, particularly those related to road transport emissions. To help us shed light on what road transport emissions looks like in Namibia and what this means for the future of transport policy, we are joined by Dr. Robert Ambunda. Dr. Robert is a transport specialist at the World Bank Group and head of the Department of Civil and Mining Engineering at the University of Namibia. Robert and his team have recently published a paper on road transport emissions in Namibia, and today we will be sharing key insights and reflections from the paper. Hello, Robert. Good to have you on this show.
Oh, hello, Polycarp. Thank you, and it's great to be here.
Thank you very much, Robert, for accepting to be my guest on the show today. Before we get into the conversation proper, can you tell us more about yourself, your research background, and the motivation behind this research on transport emissions in Namibia?
Absolutely. Well, I'm a transport engineer and researcher by training, working at the intersection of transport planning, transport emissions, road safety, and policy mainly. And I'm doing that within the space of Namibia, as well as the broader sub-Saharan African context. Lately, I've found myself in the US, so I'm also jumping on to some projects within the same research areas, mainly focused on the US, but the main focus still remains Namibia as well as a broader sub-Saharan African context. So a lot of my work still looks at how transport systems actually operate on the ground, especially in African cities and corridors, and how policy can realistically respond to the realities that we are facing within the African region. In terms of the motivation of this study, we, as the co-authors of the papers, we noticed a gap. We talk a lot about climate change and emissions in Namibia, but when it comes to road transport, which everyone uses every day, we realize that we don't have solid Namibian-specific evidence. And we find that most figures were borrowed from global databases. In some instances, we found broad regional estimates that were being used. So the goal for us was simply to quantify what road transport emissions really look like in Namibia and understand what's driving them, and then ask what can realistically be done to address that particular challenge in the Namibian context. And we hope that can then also spill over within the broader African context.
Thank you very much, Robert, and interesting to learn how you are extending your research fare out of Africa to the US. Robert, for our listeners who may not be familiar with the context, how would you describe the current state of road transport emissions in Namibia?
Well, in short, I would say it's a growing problem. It's bigger than many people actually realize. So within the Namibian context, the road transport actually accounts for more than half of Namibia's energy-related CO2 emissions, which is extremely high by global standards. So what makes it challenging is that emissions are rising steadily. And this is, in the Namibian context at least, driven by fleet growth, long travel distances. If you read up a bit on Namibia, Namibia has quite an extensive road network and longer distances between particular points. So there is a heavy reliance on private vehicles and diesel freight. At the same time, Namibia also has a relatively old vehicle fleet. And that means that there's a lot of second-hand imports and limited emissions controls as well on vehicles once they're on the road. Even though we've made a lot of progress on cleaner fuels emissions as well from transport, we are still heading in the wrong direction under a business as usual pathway. So a lot needs to be done to make sure that we achieve the targets we've set for ourselves in terms of emission reduction.
Thank you very much, Robert, for that overview of the transport landscape in Namibia. Robert, can you tell us briefly the specific issues or questions that are addressed in your paper and what methods were used to study them?
At the core of the paper, the biggest question we asked ourselves are how big are road transport emissions in Namibia? We also wanted to understand what are the vehicles that are contributing the most and how far are we from our climate targets if nothing changes. Method-wise, for us to answer these particular questions, we used the corporate emissions model, which is a widely applied international model, but we calibrated it using Namibian fuel consumption data, fleet composition, as well as vehicle activity data. And we looked at both the current emissions as well as future scenarios, one where things continue as they are, and another where mitigation measures like cleaner vehicles, electric vehicles uptake, and better public transport are introduced. So the idea wasn't just to produce numbers, as is many with most of these studies, but to make sure that we connect those numbers to policy relevant choices and to better inform those who are within the decision-making realm to be better informed and to make policy decisions that reflect the realities of emissions in the Namibian case.
At this point, I would like you to share with listeners some of the major findings from this study on road transport emissions in Namibia.
So if I have to nitpick some of the major findings, I think quite a few stand out. Firstly, the current road transport CO2 emissions are already around 2 to 2.2 million tons per year. And under business as usual, they could reach almost 3 million tons by 2030. The second key finding I would pick out would be even though the passenger cars dominate the CO2 emissions because of their sheer numbers on the Namibian roads, the fact that Namibia is also a logistics hub, we have heavy duty trucks and buses which are contributing disproportionately to air pollutants such as NOx, particulate matter to 2.5. Which have serious public health implications within the Namibian context, but I expect this to also apply within or similar to various or similar African countries with similar conditions. The third one, I believe that even under fairly ambitious mitigation scenarios, looking at what we found, emissions only dropped to about 1 to 1.2 million tons, which is still very short of Namibia's very ambitious NDC targets. So that tells us that the scale of change that is required to make sure that we meet our climate targets is quite substantial. And we really need to come to the party very fast to make sure that we address the emissions challenge in order to meet the NDC targets that Namibia has signed up for.
Thank you very much for shedding light on those findings. Robert, from the findings, what has stood out to you most about road transport emissions in Namibia and why?
What stood out the most, I think, firstly, it would be amiss if I don't give credit for the ambitious targets that Namibia has set when it comes to emissions. But there is a mismatch between the ambition and the trajectory. Namibia has one of the most ambitious emissions reduction targets globally if you look at the NDCs. Yet transport, which is the biggest emitter, is really not on track to deliver on those reductions. Another striking point is how emissions are locked into structural factors within the Namibian context. So we are talking about the long travel distances, freight dependence on roads, and basically limited alternatives to private vehicles. So it reinforces that this isn't just a technology problem. It's more of a systems and planning issue that decision makers need to address, and of course, informed by the work and research that we do to make sure that they are better informed to address some of these structural problems that can then help to make sure that the emissions targets are met.
Robert, interesting to hear that Namibia has a wonderful, ambitious transport emission plan, or with high intentions of drastically reducing emissions to its lowest level. But what bothers me, which I would like to find out from you, aside these ambitions to reduce transport emissions, what other existing policies or regulations currently govern road transport emissions in Namibia? And what are your thoughts regarding these policies?
Namibia has really made progress on fuel quality. That's one thing that stood out in the study, especially on low sulfur diesel, which is a big win, I would think. There's also a CO2 based vehicle levy and vehicle import age limit. So I think in terms of those particular governance structures, it's quite nice to see that they are being thought out and they are being implemented. However, we don't yet have the mandatory vehicle emission standards. We don't have routine emissions testing. We don't have comprehensive air quality legislation. So even though these policies exist, they are sort of fragmented and not strong enough to reverse the current trends. So my view is that fuel improvements alone won't solve the problem. We need that next layer of regulation and enforcement to catch up to make sure that we then get back on track in terms of meeting our climate targets.
Yeah, Robert, one of the contemporary issues across the world now is the issue of electric vehicles, which is aimed at reducing transport emissions. Is there any policy related to electric vehicles in Namibia?
At the moment, in terms of electric vehicles, we don't necessarily have the numbers to necessitate the discussion on policy. But I do agree that in many cases, policy has to come before we address the problem, if and when it does come to our shores. One policy that we, or rather governance document that came up was a document by the Electricity Control Board of Namibia, where they, in some way, they are talking about regulating charging infrastructure, where the infrastructure should be based, and so on. But that discussion is only at that level. Now, on the broader level, I think, and to include more stakeholders, the discussion has not really grown. But I think it's a good starting point that we are thinking about the future in terms of when and where electrical vehicles will pop up in Namibia, and how should we address their infiltration of, if I can use that word, infiltration of the market, if and when they do grow to that particular level. But it's early levels at the moment. Discussions are still ongoing. I think stakeholder engagements are still happening, but we foresee that as time goes, the discussion will grow and more governance structures in terms and regulations in terms of electrical vehicles will pop up, and we should be able to then also contribute to the African agenda in terms of how EVs, their adaptation as well as their contextualization will look like.
Thank you very much. From my experience with other African cities, one of the things I have discovered that they are doing, especially with respect to electric vehicles and importation of vehicles, which in most cases, like you raised earlier, are second-hand vehicles that are already in poor state, and usually they are the ones contributing to high level of transport emissions across sub-Saharan Africa. My question is Namibia having any policy in terms of like waiving importation duties on electric vehicles, or at this moment there is no such policy to encourage importation of e-vehicles into Namibia?
So at the moment, there is no policies or regulations in any sense to encourage the importations of EVs to the Namibian market. Rightfully so, if you think of it in the sense that infrastructure is still lagging. And in many ways, we are also struggling with supporting structures in terms of adequate electricity to the masses. So that then makes EVs sort of a secondary issue in terms of regulation and governance of that particular mode. But of course, I think to relate that, if I can just add to the conversation in that sense of what can we still do beyond EVs to make sure that we improve our emissions targets, because I think the conversation in many sense gets caught up in EVs, that we in many ways also forget that we have to try and address the current fleet composition to help us meet the emissions targets that we've set for ourselves. I think the core thing for Namibia at the moment would have to be to tighten the vehicle importation standards. And we're not only talking about the age limits, but we are also talking about the minimum emissions performance. I think that's quite important. In terms of EVs as well, if I can also tie that to public transport, the masses within the Namibian context are using what we call taxis. It's a form of shared public transport. So if we have to talk about electrifying the fleet, we have to think about what are the masses using and how can we then improve that particular mode in terms of emissions to help us meet our emissions targets. We could think about retrofitting our public transport fleet, which is the most popular form of transport, to help us actually meet our emissions targets. So EVs in the Namibian context could also think about not just private vehicles, but actually electrifying the public transport sector to address the emissions problem.
Yeah, thank you very much for shedding light. You are already going into the next question I was about to ask, which is based on your findings, what recommendations will you offer to policymakers, planners, and transport operators in Namibia, particularly in terms of transport emissions reduction?
I would highlight 4 things that would make up recommendations to policymakers and practitioners. Firstly, that would be to tighten vehicle import standards. And as I briefly mentioned, that should not only tie to age limits, but we want to make sure that it's tied to the minimum emissions performance of those particular vehicles. My second recommendation would be to look at modernizing the public and freight fleets. Namibia is a key logistic hub for many of the Southern African countries. So we want to make sure that the buses and heavy vehicles should be modernized, or at least there should be a regulation to support the modernization of those fleets. And incentives should be put in place rather than just putting together blunt bans of vehicles that don't meet those particular regulations. The third recommendation I would give would be to invest seriously in public transport and active mobility. We have to ensure that we give people alternatives. A lot of people are seeking alternatives, but a lack of that, unfortunately, forces them to private vehicles, which then becomes a challenge in terms of meeting our emissions targets. And finally, we should look at building local emissions monitoring and data systems. Because I think good policy also depends on good evidence. Once we have the evidence, we have generated the data, we understand the data, we're able to make good decisions and to develop good policy. So crucially, equity needs to stay front and center of all these recommendations. And we realize that many lower income households rely on older vehicles and are also the most exposed when it comes to pollution. So the idea is to be equitable and to make sure that everyone benefits from emissions reductions, either through health-wise or just a general sense of improved mobility for the communities within the Namibian context. And this can also apply to other African contexts as well.
Robert, taking a broader view, what role do you think road transport should play in the future of African cities, and what changes are needed to support the vision?
That's an interesting one. If I have to think about it broadly, I think road transport will remain very important in the African context, but it can't continue in its current form. African cities need to in many ways, transform their transport systems. These transport systems need to become cleaner, they need to become more efficient, and at the center of that, they need to become more people-centered. So that means fewer unnecessary trips, better public transport. We are talking about safer walking and cycling, and generally cleaner vehicle technologies. It also means that aligning transport with land use planning so that cities don't sprawl in ways that lock people into car dependence, which is an issue for many African cities. So the future is really not about copying what the Western countries and the Western cities are doing, but we have to tailor solutions that fit the African realities. I think that's always been the challenge, and we need to rewire that thinking to make sure that whatever solutions we come up with need to fit African reality and need to address the challenges that our communities are facing.
Permit me to amplify the voice of tailoring solutions that fit African context as possible way out for our transport future. Robert, before we wrap up this conversation, is there anything else you would like to share, perhaps about your future research plans or what you hope listeners take away from this conversation?
Oh, absolutely. I'm always happy to share a word or two. Personally, I'm keen on focusing more on implementation, and that ties into how policies actually work on the ground and how emissions, health, and equity intersect. Tying that into my other area of interest as well, which is road safety. I also hope, at least when it comes to this paper, it helps to shift the conversation from these abstract climate targets that we set to more practical transport decisions that affect everyday life. So if I have to give the listeners one thing to take away, I hope it's that transport emissions they are not just a climate issue. We have to understand that transport emissions are a public health concern. Transport emissions are also an economic concern, and they are a social issue. So by us addressing transport emissions, we are addressing a broader level of issues that can help us grow communities in many other aspects that are not well spoken of, but will be amplified once emissions are addressed. And that means we have to get going urgently. So implementation is key.
Transport emissions is a health concern. Transport emission is an economic concern. Transport emission is a social concern. We need to join hands together to see how we can improve our transport emission targets. That brings us to the end of this episode of your podcast on transport in Africa. Dr. Robert, thank you very much for accepting to share your insights on road transport emissions in Namibia. I wish you all the best in your professional and research journey and a wonderful stay in the US.
Thank you, Polycap, and kudos to you for this platform. I think this is a wonderful platform for us to discuss broad transportation issues within the African context, and I'm looking forward to seeing it grow from level to level so that we can capture more people to understand that transport is a lifeline, is a bloodline of economic growth within the African context, and addressing the challenges within that context will help us to grow economies and the livelihoods of various sectors of communities in the African context. Thank you, Polycap.
Thank you very much for the compliments, and thank you too for the support. If you enjoyed this episode or learned something new, please consider subscribing to our page. You can also contribute by sharing this podcast with friends and colleagues who are interested in transport and mobility issues in Africa. If you are a researcher or practitioner working on transport in Africa and would like to share your work on this platform, feel free to reach out to me at chebechesifu@campus.techno.ac.il and we can discuss how to feature your work on this show. Until next time, I am your host, Polycap Chebe. Thanks for listening and bye-bye.